Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called the 10 alternative greatest progressive rock albums of all time ranked. And this is going to be a pretty subjective list as well. There's actually hundreds of contenders for alternative progressive rock. If you accept the idea of the defining characteristic of progressive rock being that it's progressive, rather than following the genetic stylistic traits associated with the genre that we know from the 1970s that was played by bands like Genesis, ELP and King Crimson. So I've arrived at this thinking over many years. I am a progressive rock musician. I played with IQ and Frost in the mid-2000s. I also have played with bands like Magenta. I formed my own band, progressive rock band with Rob Reed called Kiyama a few years back. But throughout that process I became frustrated with the genre, and I think the reason for that was because excuse me, I've got a bit of a cough today. And I think the reason I became frustrated was because primarily I wasn't a progressive rock drummer, which is what I was getting hired to do. I realised as time went on I was much more of a composer, writer, and I wanted to make a move towards being able to write music that would be progressive. In other words, that I would be able to push the boundaries of what I'm doing. Probably about 5 years ago, I decided to put my money where my mouth is, and I formed a band called Kidderminster, where I really just did whatever I wanted to do. I just pushed the boundaries of what I wanted to do musically in a true progressive style, something that I'd learned by listening to all those bands when I was a kid, like Yes and Genesis and Gong and Gentle Giant and all those bands that I'd grown up with. Taking the spirit of that and just, not worrying about genre or complexity, and bringing in all sorts of alternative themes and ideas and putting it all into the music. When the Kidderminster album came out, I really naively thought that this album was a progressive rock album because of what I'd done, and the audience didn't see it like that at all. Then I started to see how rigid the progressive rock audience is in terms of what they accept as progressive rock or not. Now, what I've done with this list is imagine an alternative reality where bands emerged in the 70s and they were doing a number of things. Now, these criteria, these things I've sort of identified as the traits that make something progressive in my mind. There's 10 of these traits. They involve things like creating long-form compositions, using conceptual continuity, not singing about love and partying, but singing about fantasy and sci-fi ideas or stuff that's come from more literature, the use of obtuse rhythms, the use of technology, not singing in a standard pop R&B type style, but singing in a style that's much more associated with from the culture from where you come, usually British culture, and the integration of English artistic ideas into the music. All these things I think are the traits that make something progressive. And so after the failure of Kidderminster, I decided to put a progressive rock band called Rain together, and I'm pretty sure if I was to use my 10 traits, my 10 characteristics, which has now become known on this channel as the Progometer, and the Progometer is something I will attach to various bands to see how prog they are. I'm pretty sure that my band Rain would come out as 100% prog if we were to pass them through the Progometer. And yet still, when you read reviews, because we're not pushing the very specific generic buttons that are associated with certain progressive rock bands, people will turn around and go, oh, it is proggy, but it's not normal prog. The question will still be asked, right? But imagine an alternative world where that never happened. Okay, now at the end of the video I'm going to get onto what I think that did happen, but imagine an alternative world where that didn't happen and progressive rock bands produced a genre that then went out into the world doing all these things, and it progressed. And obviously 40-50 years later you wouldn't expect the music to sound the same as the bands that are out there in the 70s, would you? In much the same way is, you know, that Bring Me the Horizon, a modern metal band, sound very little like Black Sabbath from which they came, but they do not deny the lineage of that, you know. So heavy metal opens its arms far more wider range of genres within it and calls that heavy metal. But the gatekeeping that exists in progressive rock means that we haven't had since probably 1977 a progression in style. But imagine that had happened. And imagine we could then pick from certain albums, imagining that they were actually in the lineage of this true progressive rock ideal. Now, what I've done here is I've come up with 10 albums that I think if we had that, we would be stating would be the 10 greatest progressive rock albums of all time. Right? Not having to go back to the early 70s, which I get criticised for on this channel all the time. Oh, you only really look at the 70s prog. The reason is because if I look at modern progressive rock, most of the time it just seems like a generic copy of what happened before. It hasn't truly progressed. All these albums here, I think most prog fans would say are not prog. But the spirit and the artistic intent of the progressive rock project, I think, is embodied in these albums. I'm going to try and point out why, but these are 10 absolutely incredible albums. So what I have here is an alternative top 10 to my big video, which is the one that gets the most views on this channel, which is called, you know, the 10 greatest progressive rock albums, as you would expect. That's the one that gets viewed the most. So if the algorithm, if YouTube's algorithm has brought you here to this one, right, and you are an open-minded progressive rock fan that might want to just go, well, you know, let's listen to something different, you know, let's listen to something that has the progressive ideal in its DNA, but he's actually trying to do something else which is truly progressive, that might truly rock my world, that I might find perturbing. This will be the top 10 for you. Right, so going back to my band Kidderminster, when the first album came out, Prog magazine, which I find the guys there very open-minded to these ideas I'm talking about, did do a review of that album in their magazine, which I was very grateful for, because I was pretty aware that album was pretty unproggy in a sort of generic, you know, from a generic viewpoint, and that album got compared to an album by a R&B artist called Janelle Monáe called Arch Android, and that's what I want to put it at number 10, because I went to check out this album and I put it on. And I was quite shocked as what was going on in this album. So Janelle Monáe is a R&B artist, a pop artist, I suppose, but she pushes the envelope of what pop music is, right? In 2007, she brought out an EP called Metropolis: The Chase Suite, and this was part one of a conceptual story that was going to start on this EP and then get finished on this epic conceptual R&B album, Arch Android. And this story, right, so you got the first part on the EP, The Chase Suite, and then you've got parts 2 and 3 on this album, Arch Android. And the story is about an android, a robot, called Cindy Mayweather, and this is like a messianic android that comes back in time to free the citizens of Metropolis, and this Metropolis is very based upon the Metropolis that we see in the Fritz Lang, you know, silent movie from the 1920s. The citizens of Metropolis are under this sort of authoritarian, totalitarian leadership called the Great Divide, and this is a secret society that uses time travel to suppress freedom and love. And so Cindy Mayweather returns to try and fix that in sort of Terminator style, and it pulls in a whole ton of different science fiction, different film allusions, story allusions. And when you get into the music, this album, Arch Android, it actually starts with an orchestral overture. This is in many ways dripping with the ideas that have been inherited from progressive rock. Musically, it explores a sort of rhythm and blues approach, but it's also rooted in sort of funk, especially sort of the George Clinton, you know, Afro science fiction idea of funk. It's also rooted in groups like, I think, Talking Heads and the Tom Tom Club and David Bowie. All that sort of art rock stuff is crammed in here as well. This is a really, really interesting album. The tracks on their own, in many cases, stand up as really tightly constructed pop songs. But pop songs that are way past, the average pop song that you would have today. Very funky, very well produced. I think there's a production credit on here for Sean Diddy Coombs, Puff Daddy. There's actually a production credit there, and there's not many albums that I talk about on this channel where we can say that. But here we have basically a modern-ish pop album. This album came out in 2010, which I think has a ton of prog in its DNA. If I was to pass it through the progometer, I think it would be not scoring that high on the idea of the integration of the English aesthetic and not singing in a sort of non-rhythm and blues style. So I know it wouldn't fulfill those, but I think it would fulfill everything else. So this album is on my progometer would be coming in at 70-80% prog, which is actually higher than some progressive rock albums that we discuss in the mainstream. So that's what I've got at number 10 is Janelle Monáe, Arch Android. Okay, so if you're watching this list now, you can now see where this list is going to go. So purist prog fans, you better switch off right now. There's no point you watching this. There's going to be no albums from Genesis or King Crimson. It's not like I'm here to tell you that Tricky of the Tail was the best Genesis album, and that's the shock that we're going to get on this video. No, this is going to be a list of alternative progressive rock albums and my 10 favourite, and what I've decided is the 10 greatest alternative progressive rock albums. So at number 9, I have Time by Louis Cole. Louis Cole is a multi-instrumentalist musician that's emerged very recently in the last 5 or 6 years. He emerged in the band Noah when they brought out a video of them playing the track Overtime in what looked like their sort of living room. It was very YouTubey, very memey. It went very viral. The band got noticed by a whole bunch of people in the industry, including the Red Hot Chili Peppers, who then took them out on tour. And it uncovered what I think is a true progressive genius, which is Louis Cole. Louis Cole has a vision that we would associate with the great auteurs of progressive rock. He's an incredible drummer. He's an incredible multi-instrumentalist. He's a singer, he's a composer, he's a arranger. His music explores the outer edges of post drum and bass jungle house techno music, combined with sort of dark influences coming from electric post pitches brew Miles Davis. He winds that all together into sort of a very sort of postmodern ironic view of the world. It's very integrated into modern technology, into YouTube, Instagram. It's very memey. It is thoroughly modern music, but it's modern music that does not pull any punches. I didn't really know which album to put up. I think in terms of progressiveness, there is an album that came out around the same time as Time. It's like an EP, and it's called something like Live Session and additional tracks. It was a sort of throwaway album. That's probably his most proggy of all the albums that have come out. But I think in terms of mainstream Louis Cole, for people who want to be introduced to the guy and really hear what he's about, I think I would go with Time. Time is a sort of bubbling, very funky dance music infused album, which also has sort of very chill out, ballad type tracks, very influenced by almost like a Beach Boys sound. He reminds me of a modern Lewis Taylor, and Lewis Taylor could well have been on this list. So I'm going to mention him again. Lewis Taylor was a sort of post acid jazz neo soul British singer-songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, an absolute genius that made a run of albums in the mid-2000s that were absolutely incredible. He's actually, after sort of dropping into obscurity, he's actually put an album out quite recently, which has sort of just appeared. Anyway, very mysterious character. But I see Louis Cole as carrying on in that tradition. And these, for me, are the true progressive artists of the modern age. You know, this is why when people start mentioning modern progressive rock bands to me, I don't listen to them. I listen to these artists. These are the artists I'm listening to at the moment. And for me, one of the great progressive musicians on the planet is Louis Cole with his album Time, which I got at number 9. I believe that in the early 90s, there was another second wave of progressive music. There was another era that is like an echo of the classic progressive rock era of the 1970s. Towards the end of the 80s, we'd had the electronic music, IDM, dance music, house, techno thing emerged. Here in the UK, that became a very hippified thing with raves, sort of counterculture, new age traveller sort of thing. And with that sort of almost like hippified audience, the same, it's very much like a copy of Woodstock, if you can imagine that. That happened in the UK in the early 90s, and those that audience embraced a sort of progressive rock aesthetic, but much more on the sort of trippy Hawkwind gong side, right? And I think this changed music, and it allowed musicians across that whole genre of drum and bass, jungle, hip hop, and also even fringes of metal, rap, house music. There was an expansive progressiveness, and suddenly we had in the early 90s a whole range of albums that were huge selling, which I feel creates like a second wave of progressiveness, right? Where progressive ideas were at the top of the charts. You know, the best example I can give of this is Radiohead. Radiohead come out with sort of post-grunge, post-indie way of making music from the late 80s, early 90s, and then they get caught up in this wave. And by the time they're making albums like Kid A and Amnesiac, these albums are basically going to the top of the charts, but they're heavy, conceptual, electronic, progressive rock albums, you know, that just seem to be channeling the spirit of groups like Tangerine Dream and Pink Floyd. It's an incredible thing, and there's a whole host of these albums. Now, I could have filled up the list with these albums, and I nearly started putting Radiohead albums on, and, you know, if I was really being objective, I would say OK Computer, Kid A and Amnesiac. Those 3 albums deserve to be on this list of 3 of the greatest alternative progressive rock albums of all time. But I haven't, because I wanted to get into the nooks and crannies and really pull out my favourite albums from that era. So at number 8, I have one of those albums. This is the album 2 Pages by the group 4Hero. 4Hero emerged in the early 90s as pioneers of jungle, which then turns into drum and bass. And there's a wing of drum and bass which then sort of links up with jazz and progressive rock. This is really pioneered by Goldie on the album Timeless and Ronnie Size on the album Lifeforms. Again, 2 albums that could have easily made this list. But the album I want to go for is 2 Pages by 4Hero. This album is quite incredible. It's a double album. The first disc is a sort of it's like a funky jazz, fantasy, spiritual, esoteric, conceptual piece which draws in orchestral material. It draws in electronic material. It's all played live with real musicians. It's an absolutely incredible masterpiece. If you're a progressive rock fan with an open mind, you need to hear the first disc of 2 Pages. The second disc is a full-on electronic drum and bass. Very jazzy, very esoteric drum and bass, but that's what we have on the second disc. This is actual monumental masterpiece. You know, there was so much going on at that time. And another album that I was actually a massive fan, and as I'm telling you about 2 Pages, there's another album that could have well have made this list as well, and that is Time Capsule by Chris Bowden, you know, the great British jazz saxophone player, which for me explores similar areas, you know, which is somewhere between sort of electronic music and drum and bass, trip hop, full on jazz, full on classical orchestral music, all put together. Absolutely incredible stuff going on at this time. But I think the album I'm going to put in at number 8 is 2 Pages for Hero. It wasn't just electronic music and dance music that was changed by this period in the early 90s. Rock music had the same thing. Rock music had a big kick up the bum when Nirvana and the grunge bands came out, Soundgarden. But at the same time, there were other bands looking towards rap and funk and metal for inspiration. Obviously bands like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Faith No More, that were exploring and widening the range of what could happen in alternative heavy rock, heavy metal. A number of bands emerged at that time. For me, the absolute kings of that sort of funk metal style were Fishbone. And Fishbone went beyond just taking influences funk. They would take influences from ska bands like the Specials and Madness. They would take influences from sort of traditional New Orleans jazz. They would take influences from people like Curtis Mayfield and 70s funk. There was just a whole range of stuff. And they released a series of albums. I think they released their peak with A Reality of My Surroundings, which, although it's not a concept album, has a sort of conceptual continuity, and you really feel that this is a black Afro-American rock band making a great big comment on the situation which they find themselves in America. And the whole track flows and the tracks bleed in from one to the other and explores a whole bunch of areas. So for me, it's always played out like a huge concept album, and it just sort of goes down certain alleys and we get all sorts of different things on there. Fishbone were not only a great rock band, guitar, bass, drums and all that, they could also whip out brass and turn themselves into a frontline New Orleans type traditional jazz group, which they do on this album to such a great effect. So absolute masterpiece of album, and it's really pointing at a whole bunch of albums that had come out in the early 90s under the sort of funk metal album, the sort of funk metal moniker, which I think that they had progressive tendencies without a doubt, but for me, if you really want to hear that at its peak, then it's Reality of My Surroundings by Fishbone, which I've got at number 7. At the fringes of this sort of heavy metal movement, there were bands like Faith No More that were exploring quite darker areas of heavy rock and heavy metal, and there was a movement with various bands where they were moving towards, and this has really come out of sort of thrash metal and death metal, which is exploring the areas between that style and free jazz. Anybody who's exploring the outer limits of what is what you could perceive as the extremes of noise, and then listening to bands like Napalm Death. The next step after that is to move to free jazz, people like Peter Brotzmann. And in the 80s, there were bands like Last Exit that were going heavier and louder and faster than any metal band were doing, absolutely proper terrifying stuff. Within that scene in New York emerged a jazz musician called John Zorn. And John Zorn had his own take on all of this stuff. And John Zorn's music was almost like a young jazz fan that's just hungry for everything. And they are basically, they got the radio on and they're just switching from channel to channel and just sucking in absolutely everything all the time. And that's what Zorn's music sounds like. In the mid-80s, he formed a band that wanted to explore extremes of death metal, noise, dark ambience, classical music, rock, jazz, the whole gamut. And this band was called Naked City, and they made a whole ton of albums which are unbelievably progressive in their nature. Someone said a comment on the channel a few days ago that really made me laugh, because they said, they were talking about my progometer, this thing that determines what is prog, and they said they'd put Naked City in it and it had broken it, which of course it would. The album I'm going to put forward as number 6 by Naked City is Grand Guignol, a dark gothic masterpiece, right? Which opens with the track Grand Guignol, which is just the most bleakest, deepest, darkest gothic piece of improvisatory jazz rock electronic, whatever, ambient, classical. I don't know what you want to call it. It's a terrifying piece of music. It's then followed up by their interpretations of various classical pieces, which is very interesting. And then you get something like 40 Napalm Death-esque, tiny little short, sort of, I'd call them extreme metal tracks, but within that they basically cover every style of music, from country and western to sort of Italian film music like Ennio Morricone to sort of surf to avant-garde noise. I'm really having a difficult time describing this album. It's probably the most progressive album ever made by anybody. Grand Guignol, if you truly are a progressive rock fan and that's what you think you're into, then go and check out Grand Guignol by Naked City and tell me what you think. This is a very heavy album, an extreme album with an extreme cover. The whole thing about this album is exploring the netherworld, the darkness of humanity. What exists in our collective shadow. That's what I think this album is about. All the other Naked City albums are incredible. In terms of sort of virtuoso complexity, there's an album called, I think, Radio that came out after this one. That is pretty incredible. I nearly put that on the list. But for me, my favourite Naked City album has always been Grand Guignol. That was the one that I, in the early 90s, just was obsessed by listening to every day. And that's what I've got at number 6. Right. So, going back to For Hero and that whole drum and bass experiment that happened in the 90s and the way that developed and went more and more avant-garde, we have to give a shout out to the absolute king of extreme drum and bass, which some critics have actually called drill and bass, and that is the incredible Squarepusher. Squarepusher emerged in the sort of mid-90s with an album called Feed Me Weird Things, an incredible album. And then in 1997 he moved to Warp Records and released his second album, which I think is his masterpiece, which is called Hard Normal Daddy. This is an absolutely incredible album that blends drill and bass with extreme noise, electronic experimentation, but also explores a world which is very close to the albums of Herbie Hancock, that sort of Headhunters, funky world, but it also even goes further into a sort of almost like 70s cop show. I think really he's exploring albums like Death Wish by Herbie Hancock or the Lalo Schifrin soundtracks for Dirty Harry. It has that feel as well, but it also has a very English feel. You feel there's the spirit of the English rave hangs over this album as well. It's absolutely extreme, out there stuff. It's mind-blowing, as Squarepusher's stuff is. But with other albums where I feel like Squarepusher will go down a certain avenue and explore it to death, So on the first album, Feed Me Weird Things, it's just a head spinning, exploration of pushing the sort of glitchy drum and bass programming to the limit. And then on say something like, my mind's gone blank. Music is Rotted One Note, which is another Squarepusher album. He explores a sort of dark post-Bitches Brew experimental improvisation. For jazz fans, that's the one to go for. There's other albums that are just full on house music. But on Hard Normal Daddy, Squarepusher's excesses are actually pulled in, and there's a conciseness to the album. There's a catchiness at certain points and an exploratoriness at other points. And that drawing in the sort of structural framework that he puts on this album, for me, makes it feel a little bit more proggy. It's a little bit more controlled. It's very complex in the arrangements. Squarepusher is not only a drum and bass programmer, but he's also a bass player and a drummer. There's virtuosity on this album, especially on the bass, which is quite unparalleled in drum and bass and dance music and electronic music. Squarepusher occupies his own world to me, and I'm very pleased to have him at number 5 on this list. Going back to Fishbone and Faith No More, when I was talking about that band, I was really trying to avoid mentioning this band, which was sort of, for me, the peak of that sort of post-grunge, post-alternative, avant-garde rock scene that emerged in the early 90s. That band is, of course, Mr. Bungle. Mr. Bungle is the other band that Mike Patton, the lead singer of Faith No More, was in. They're much more extreme than Faith No More. They explore sort of heavy rock, heavy metal, but a little bit like Naked City, melded together with sort of avant-garde, extreme free jazz, but they're also really into sort of, you know, foreign soundtracks, you know, movie soundtracks. They're into sort of surf music and a whole host of Arabic music. There's 3 albums. The first Mr. Bungle album, which I was going to put on the list, but the first Mr. Bungle album is pretty out there, but does sort of contain very proggy, heavy rock songs, which sort of expand and go out in the Mr. Bungle way. But the second album, Disco Volante, I'm going to put on the list. Disco Volante, for me, is the absolute masterpiece. It's the most extreme avant-garde album. It's so conceptual in its nature. It's sort of the thing that makes Mr. Bungle so interesting, in amongst all the avant-garde screaming and shouting and the sort of, you know, rapid passages that run between sort of thrash metal into sort of free jazz, is this sort of filmic aspect that they have. The album Disco Volante is actually named after the boat Disco Volante in Thunderball. And Disco Volante is actually Italian for flying saucer. And we have sort of... There's so many influences on this album, and it twists and turns. There's secret tracks, there's suites which have multiple parts, there's incredible music that sounds almost like sort of, you know, alternative Arabic, insane dubby house music. This is the thing with these albums. All these albums on this list are really beyond category. Here I'm trying to describe them. It might be best for me not to and say, you know, just go and check them out. You know, so many people say, can you play the tracks on the videos? If I was to do that, I'm pretty sure the video would just get blocked, especially when you're doing a top 10. Well, you know, one of those labels will just block it. I had one video blocked once, and I was like, oh my God, all that work, and then suddenly this video was gone, and there was nothing I could do about it. It was gone. You know, I could edit it out, but once you edit it out, you're not being true to what you've set out to do. So that's why you don't hear it. But a couple of people who watch the channel said they'll watch the video, then they'll line up the tracks on YouTube and listen to them in the background as I'm talking, which might be a good thing. And the whole point of this is celebrating albums that you guys love, but also trying to introduce you to some other albums. And basically, if you watch this channel and you like my taste in progressive rock and jazz fusion, you may find that some of these albums could well become your favourite albums. And if you're out for something extreme, which is what we've got on this list, then why don't head over to, you know, get a copy of Disco Volante by Mr. Bungle, an absolute incredible album. Right. The next album, number 3 on this list, this is really what I mean by that prog renaissance that happens in the 90s. Can you imagine a band releasing a double album, right, which features members of Public Image Limited, members of Gong, creating trippy, sidelong epics, right, which explore alien life forms, UFOs, right? Imagine someone bringing an album out like that in 1992. And here in the UK, that album, that progressive rock double album with these sidelong epics, with all this insane Steve Hillage-esque post-Gong, post-Hawkwind, trippy Tangerine Dream insanity going on for hours and hours. Imagine a band bringing an album out like that in 92 and it going straight to number 1 in the album charts here in the UK, and the singles going straight to the top of the charts, right? That's what we have with what I've got at number 3. That album is, of course, U.F.Orb by the electronic ambient duo The Orb. This album is monumental, was huge in this country. It really was the pinnacle of that hippie thing that I was describing that happened during the rave culture. The Orb were bringing out singles that were literally album length. You know, you'd have a single come out with 2 tracks on, and each track would be 15 minutes long. It broke the single system. This band really achieved something, as did a whole bunch of other bands behind them. Like, I'm thinking of Future Sound of London and Orbital, Aphex Twin, or Tekra, Photech. There's all these bands, really interesting bands, which for me have come out of the spirit progressive rock bands, and their roots go right back to bands like Tangerine Dream and Mike Oldfield, Tubular Bells. That's what we've got here. And in the Orb's case, a just massively challenging channeling gong, sorry. U.F.Orb contains a track called The Blue Room that was released as a single. It's 17 minutes long. It features not only as performers but also as writers and producers Miket Gardi and Steve Hillage from Gong, and we've also got the great Jar Wobble on bass. The Orb are like a sort of dubby, trippy version of Gong. This is incredible, and I have to pinch myself to think that this went to #1 here in this country. It was followed up in 1997 by actually a remix of the Gong album You, which came out. An incredible album where you had people like the Orb and a whole bunch of other sort of electronic dance rave, producers, remixing their version of the album You by Gong. When I put on my mainstream top 10 prog albums, the album You by Gong, the prog fans, which I don't think are used to that album, are like, why's that album on? You're going to take it off, you're going to put something else on, don't put that on. Where's Camel? Why haven't you got Camel on there? But I think what it is that audience do not realise how influential that album is. And without Gong's You, we would just not have had this #1 album, and hundreds of thousands of people spending their weekend in fields dancing up and down to basically Gong. This is an incredible thing. That's what I've got at #3. The album still sounds, up 30 years later, it still sounds fresh and exciting. This was when popular music was just doing things that you don't expect popular music to do, all in the early 90s within this, prog renaissance that was going on. And the next album I've got on the list is another album that was a huge chart-topping album, by one of our great iconic pop artists of all time, and is full-on experimental progressive music. This is, of course, at #2, the album Homogenic by Björk. I haven't talked about Björk on this channel much. I'm an absolutely massive Björk fan. Björk emerged in the late 80s. She emerged before in her home country of Iceland as a sort of, child prodigy singing Icelandic folk songs. She then forms a sort of indie band called the Sugar Cubes. I've got to make sure I don't say Sugar Babes. The Sugar Cubes. And that's where I discovered her. When I was at art college, all the sort of arty mates I had were really into all this sort of alternative rock stuff, and this indie band came out. And I remember spotting her as being different from your usual indie sort of front person. Very interesting character, elf-like, sort of small and tiny and other, right? There was actually in 80s alternative music that sort of hippified, weird, esoteric, fairy-like thing that sometimes emerged. I'm thinking in groups like the Cocteau Twins, much more subtler. And I think, of course, Kate Bush had pursued these sort of ideas. Björk was a real personification of that. In the early 90s, around about 90, I'd say about 93, she signs a deal with One Little Indian, and she decides to change her style, and she's really exploring these ideas that are coming out of electronics music, dance music, alternative music, and she brings out in 93 an album called Debut, which is not only exploratory avant-garde, but also is very accessible and very commercial, and she has God knows how many hit records, and she emerges then as a sort of pop superstar. Björk is an incredible pop artist that has never had to compromise at all. She's always explored different areas. The first album has some incredible stuff on. I was listening to the other day, absolutely incredible stuff. The second album, Post, she sort of generically pushes the boat out even more, and she's really trying to almost do the listener's head in. We sort of have that sort of big beat Led Zeppelin opener, Army of Me, and then pretty much you then dropped into sort of this sort of quiet, electronic sort of trip hop stuff, and then you get her big band version of It's So So Quiet. Post, she's trying to really do the listeners' heads in by just having such a wide range. This is so proggy, and I nearly wanted to put Post on there. On Homogenic, though, I think this is a masterpiece, and what she does is she actually lays out the sound of the album much more considered. She's not going to keep jumping all over here, and you're not going to get like a techno track, house track, and then, you know, a jazz standard played on harps. You're not going to get that wide range. She's going for a very delineated sound, which is sort of electronica, highly programmed electronic, exploring what the limits of what sampling and that digital technology can do at the time, with a sort of orchestral orchestral structure. She brought Emil Deodato in, you know, who is has his progressive credentials, you know, as being one of the greats of the 70s. And Deodato creates incredible string arrangements. And that sound, for me, is almost like the 1990s version of progressive rock. It's where progressive rock could well have gone if whatever happened to progressive rock, so that the doors, you know, the shutters came closed, which I'm going to talk about at the end of this video. If that happened, I think we would have obviously see the line that runs from Yes and Genesis and the Moody Blues and all those, you know, Atom Heart Mother and what they're trying to do on those tracks, and what Björk's trying to do on this album, Homogenic. I think it's a real masterpiece. She released an album after this called Selma's Song, which is the sound for Dancer in the Dark. That is actually my favourite Björk album. I nearly wanted to put it in. It's an incredible album. If anyone's watched the film, it's a Lars von Trier's film. It's pretty heavy, and in that she plays, because Björk acts in it, and she plays a blind mother that's trying to save the sight of her child by working in a factory which is has like all this heavy machinery, which is quite dangerous for her, but she has to keep working to make the money to pay for this operation. And but she dreams of like Hollywood musicals, and it's an incredible film which is shot sort of on high-8 video cameras, so it looks very documentary, but within that, certain times the soundtrack of sounds that she sings, so she'll be working in a factory and those sounds of the machines will start to join together and form into beats, and then she would sing over that, and then suddenly it opens up to these huge, you know, song and dance pieces. It's an absolutely incredible album. It would be on the list of my top 10 albums if it wasn't so dark and depressing that I can't watch it. I can't watch the album without coming out with a massive depression. But the soundtrack to that also features Tom York on vocals on certain tracks, is absolutely monumental. She's gone on to make albums which are completely a cappella, where everything's created by the voice. She's made albums which are completely orchestral. Björk is a heavyweight. She is a true progressive artist without a doubt. And when we're talking about the lineage of progressive rock, she should be in there, mentioned in the same breath as Yes and Genesis. But she's not, is she? Right? And I'm going to come back to that at the end of this video. So, I've got to number one. Those of you who watch my channel, and this is the main reason why I wanted to do this video. Those of you who watch this channel, as time has gone on and I've really studied and listened to so many bands, even though I'm a huge Yes and King Crimson fan, and that's the stuff I love. Standing back and being objective, there's one band that's come out for me as being the greatest progressive rock band of all time. And that band is Cardiacs. But Cardiacs are so way beyond the genre of progressive rock, that it's really hard to pigeonhole them, right? I really felt I needed to create this list of alternative progressive rock music to place this album at number one. Now, I could have placed many of the albums at number ones, and the Cardiacs fans will be shouting at me and saying you shouldn't have put this album at number one, but I'm going with Sing to God as the incredible double album that came out in 1996-97, I think. Which is just such a huge prog statement. It's absolutely mind-blowing. This album is just something else, and it's real testament to the genius of Tim Smith. Tomorrow in Kidderminster, my hometown, there's a progressive rock band playing, great progressive rock band fronted by the great John Young, called Life Signs, and I'm hoping to pop down to meet those guys. I know John Young, but on the bass they have a guy called John Paul, who I've spoken to a couple of times, but I don't know, and I'm going down to see the guys, and hopefully I'm going to make friends with John Paul, because John Paul was a contributor, a main contributor to this album, Sing to God, you know, which I feel is one of the greatest progressive rock band albums of all time. And I'm hoping to secure an interview with John where I can really get into that album. So I don't want to talk too much about it. All I'm going to say, if you are a prog fan and you've watched this to this point and you've got to the end of the video and you've gone, God, Andy's put this album as not just being the greatest alternative progressive rock album of all time, but also the greatest prog album of all time, well, go and check it out and have a listen. It's a difficult listen. Imagine taking progressive rock and boiling it down till you've got concentrated progressive rock. Right, imagine that. And then you take that concentrated progressive rock and you cram that into every nook and cranny of every song on an album which is a double album's length. So it just pummels you, that every inch of it, you could take any part of this, any tiny square of this album and open it up and you would have a whole world of progressive rock. And then you could take another square of this album, open it up and you would have another world, another fractal would open up into another completely different universe of progressive rock. That's what this album's like for me. It's a difficult listen. When I first put it on, I got about halfway through disc one and had to switch it off. It was just so intense. The track Dirty Boy, I think, is one of the greatest songs ever made. And it is just sort of the blueprint of what Cardiacs are all about to me. It really goes back to what the whole of jazz, rock, blues is. It's the profane and the sacred mixed together, right? That is what the whole of it is, all of it, right? From the Ramones, in the Sex Pistols, through to Little Richard, through to Duke Ellington, to Count Basie, to Billie Holiday, to King Crimson, to Henry Cow. All of it, when it is great, is these two elements put together, the profane and the sacred, married together, these two elements of humanity that in normal life we have a great difficulty in marrying. And the Cardiacs do it brilliantly, albeit esoterically and inaccessible for most people, but they do it in a way that for me is pure genius. So that's what I've got at number one. So now you've heard my alternative prog top 10 album list. Why don't these albums, why aren't they mentioned in the genre? Why isn't this the lineage where we say this style of music came out and then this style of music progressed through the 80s and 90s and it transformed, it progressed? Because you would think that a genre which is called progressive rock would have progressed the most. You would expect the stuff that emerges in the late 60s, 50 years ago, to what you have now to be entirely different, that we would have something that sounds completely evolved, right? And that's the argument I've got here. I've tried to track that through, and I've really tried to cover the last 30 years, and I've got a couple of albums. I think the most recent album is the album Time by Louis Cole, which I think is a couple of years old. So I'm hoping I've been able to sort of show this alternative history here that could have been progressive rock's history. I'm not saying it is. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of prog fans, the ones that are telling me that Pink Floyd aren't prog and telling me that Moving Pictures and Rush aren't prog, and you can see that is the big narrative theme of my channel at the moment. They're horrified for me to say an album by Janelle Monáe is prog. They will be absolutely horrified by that. Where has that come from? Well, I'm going to try and tell you why I think it is. Progressive rock emerges in the late 60s. It's seen as a much wider genre straight off than we do now. So, groups like the Moody Blues, Procol Harum, Edgar Broughton Band, David Bowie, all of these artists would be seen as being progressive rock. As that emerges, all the bands are trying to push the genre forward because it's selling albums. There has been a renaissance in terms of music listening, because now most people have a hi-fi in their house, a stereo hi-fi, and one of the entertainment ways that people can entertain themselves in their house, probably the most opulent and expansive, is the stereo hi-fi. They can huddle around their little colour television and tune it in and get that little screen there with a little mono sound coming out the side. They can read a book, they can put the radio on. But a stereo hi-fi, that is like entering into a world. It becomes cinematic, and bands realise that people they want that experience, so they start to step up. And by the early 70s, we get albums like Close to the Edge and Dark Side of the Moon, Thick as a Brick, and then Tubular Bells, where people are going on a journey, right? But for the audience, that will only last a certain time. And there's a visceral nature to rock music where people want to also go out and party and dance and have a good time. And of course the pendulum swings, okay? Now, also, within this genre that's been championed by the critics, right? Music critics in the 1970s and the music press, that's where most people are finding out about this stuff. They're not tuning into the internet. They're buying, the NME. And the NME turn on progressive rock. And they don't just go, oh, there's other bands out there and this is really interesting. They don't do that. They turn on them and they vilify the genre. And they do a really good hatchet job of taking the power of the genre away by sort of putting them in the corner of this sort of funny, overindulgent dinosaur, which is the products of sort of white middle class males, from a privileged background. All that narrative comes in and it's all shelved into the corner. It's all stuck into the corner. By the time I come to appreciating music in the early 80s, we're in a post-punk world, and basically, yes, Genesis, King Crimson, and even bands like Led Zeppelin are dirty words. That it's the worst. But of course, all the bands that are emerging in the 80s, like Duran Duran and Culture Club, here in the UK especially, ABC, Yazoo, Human League, right? In their DNA, there's as much of the prog experiment, but they keep it all quiet. The guy that was behind Erasure, what's his name? Vince, can't remember, the main guy behind Erasure. I can remember much later on, he wouldn't have said it at the time, but much later on I read an interview and he said his favourite band was the sort of Peter Gabriel era Genesis. So we all know it's there, and this is where the progressive rock ideal becomes esoteric. It has to hide away like this. But the name of progressive rock is made dirty, right? And anyone who's cool of a certain era will never admit to liking it. And people of an older era, they're having to keep quiet about it. And I think what that did is it then it stultifies the genre. So in 1977, that genre stops, right? The bands that come out, the punk bands and then the post-punk bands, right, which you could see and argue is actually not a reaction against prog, but is the next natural evolution of prog. All right, there's a lot of things that the punk bands do that the progressive rock bands do. They're related. There's a reaction to progressive rock bands with the punk bands, which is the same reaction that we get to sort of hair metal by the grunge bands. But that movement did not deny the fact that those 80 bands were heavy metal. If you're listening to sort of David Lee Roth Eaton and Smile in 1986, and then you go and start listening to Soundgarden and Nirvana, you don't feel like you've traversed over a divide. You're still in sort of roughly the same area generically. But with progressive rock, that doesn't happen, right? And even though, as I've said on this channel, if we take, for example, the Sex Pistols as an example, even though John Lydon is pulling, literary allusions into the music, he's channeling, the ideas that he's seen on, say, interpretations of Richard III. He's seen Laurence Olivier's version of Richard III, and he's incorporated that into his sort of image. There's a huge integration of the English aesthetic, and you can also see that sort of the Aqualung John Anderson imagery that he not John Anderson, Ian Anderson portrays on the album Aqualung is also wound into the Sex Pistols, and most importantly the vocal style that comes directly from Peter Hamill Van der Graaf Generator. Lydon's also listened to bands like Captain Beefheart and Zappa. If you see a photograph of him in 1970, he looks like your archetypal prog fan with long hair. So what he's done is he's accentuated certain aspects of progressive rock. The Damned do the same thing. The Stranglers do the same thing. The Clash do the same thing in their own way. It freshens up and it takes some of the sort of outlandish bombast of progressive rock and it draws it in. Now, straight away, what we see then in bands like The Cure and the Human League, in bands like Joy Division, we see progressive rock shatter and change and go down another angle. We also see the same thing happen to heavy rock. Heavy rock comes along, punk comes along, it shows up heavy rock in a certain way, and the heavy rock bands have to harden up, and we get Judas Priest and eventually Iron Maiden, Diamond Head, really hardening up the sound and making it heavier. But also bands like Diamond Head and Iron Maiden, they then open their arms and they pull progressive rock, and we see that esoteric beast of progressive DNA channel its way through to progressive metal and thrash metal and all that type of thing. So what I call the prog DNA, that travels through this little bottleneck. But the idea of prog is shut down, right? A little bit like a successful town that suddenly loses its reason to exist and then freezes in time. That's what happens to actual progressive rock. And it's shut down. And because of that sort of vilification that was pushed by the critics at the time, nobody wants to admit the influence of progressive rock in the 80s, and nobody wants to go too near it, even though exploratory musicians do. And you see people still making concept albums. You know, if you think of a band like Tears for Fears, by the mid-80s they are having huge success making pretty much progressive rock albums, except that they're just drawn in. But we also see a band like the Cardiacs take everything, you know, rock, avant-garde, prog, the whole lot, and just put it through this big nuclear reactor, and they spend the 80s and the 90s, you know, sculpting this incredible take on progressive rock, which for me is in the direct lineage, right? So as much, yes, I'm going to accept that bands like Dream Theater, Porcupine Tree, Tool, Mars Volta, they are all part of the progressive rock history, but there's a line of music making which is actually far more progressive, which has been shut off and excluded from the story of what progressive rock is, right? There's nothing that can be done about that, right? There is nothing that can be done. But wouldn't it be interesting if that hadn't have happened? Wouldn't it be interesting in, rather than everything that I just described happening, but except for the critics' reaction to prog, the way that they decided to make themselves look better? You know why they did it? Because I believe that what is inherent in progressive rock, which is just normal people trying to elevate themselves through a mass cultural entity, which at the time was popular music, rock and roll, whatever it is, trying to advance themselves, the elites don't like it. The elites will cordon off opera, you know, high art. That will never go away. They will fund that because that is the badge that proves that they are an elite. But they do not like normal people aspiring to that. Us normal people should be dumb and stupid and jumping around to, you know, the Ramones, because that is what we are, and that shows that we are authentic when we do that. Authentic. And that is what the critics play, is that idea. You know, the idea that Yes would make a double album based upon the esoteric teachings of a yogi. No, you shouldn't have that. And the critics whose interest was to maintain their position, to not point out and tell the story of what was going on in music, but to create a position in themselves by placing themselves at the centre of the narrative. You know, most music critique is not about the music, it's about the critic. It's about them saying, aren't I clever because I can see this? And they love to point to something and say, you see this itinerant musician that is full of authenticity, that is full of a sort of inbuilt, innate talent that they don't understand because they're real. They're really doing it. There they are, you know, doing their thing that they don't understand, but it's true because they don't understand it. And me, being a literate, clever person with my degree in English, I can point to it and tell you lot why this is so great. These, you know, art school educated middle class people over here that, you know all their Greek mythology and they know their Shakespeare and they're winding into their music, they're just showing off. And there's something really interesting for me. I once met Steve Hackett. It was at an awards show and I shared a dressing with him. And Steve Hackett turned around and he said, I'm a working class lad from, I think, London. That's my background, you know. This is like John Lydon, genius working class musicians like the Beatles, right? So much of prog is being created by those, as well as the sort of private school educated, you know, upper classes. Okay, it's been made by the great swathe, and that class system that exists in the UK, which is one of the most awful things about this country. Right, that class system has been lampooned and pulled apart in so many art forms. It's been pulled apart by sort of music hall. It's been pulled apart by the great sort of war comedies of the, you know, the Crazy Gang and George Formby, Old Mother Riley. It's been pulled apart by the Goons, by Monty Python, by Fawlty Towers. All that tradition, Dad's Army. It's been pushed apart, and in the 60s, I think, in England, it's the coming together of that sort of working class didactic self-taught, you know, where rather than going through a schooled process where you're told about the classics by a teacher in a private school, you've learnt about stuff for yourself. The autodidact, that is something that I feel is in the sort of homemade quality of progressive rock, which makes it absolutely fascinating. And I think that the powers that be, the elites, don't like it. As I think it's as simple as that. And so they've done their best to cordon that experiment off. And I'm pretty sure that any artist now that tries to go towards that will get accused of that. Right? So what we see nowadays is news stories about, you know, Sam Smith, you know, and the fact that he's about his gender, or the fact he's dressed in a bizarre costume, although he's made a video which is exploring sort of sexual content, and he's mainly liked by children, all that sort of stuff that goes on. That is what the media, that's the way it wants to focus on music. What's Sam Smith's music about? What does he say? What's it actually about? Musically and narratively, what's it about? Right? What has he done vocally that's innovative? What has he done songwriting that's innovative? What are the songs about? What concepts is he exploring that are needed by today's culture, which are answering a question which is being posed by what is going on today? Is it really that, or is it just safe pop music, which is just pushing the right buttons? Right? People don't like, the elites do not like when normal people start asking questions. Be aware of this the whole time. It's always the way. It's the way that people are controlled. And so this channel here, when I get to discuss this stuff, we're off in the corner. No one's really watching except you lot. It all seems very silly, and you go, what, Andy's spending his time doing these stupid prog top tens. But under that, as soon as we open any aspect of art and start to explore it, it's like William Blake with his grain of sand. If you open up that grain of sand, the universe is inside that. And for me, the great art form of the last 50 years has been rock music. That's the great art form. Before that, it was cinema. Now it's probably interactive computer games. I've seen things in Fortnite happen which are so prog, it just makes your jaw drop. But for the last 50 years, for my era, it's been rock. And I think to try and understand what was actually going on, rather than the grand narrative which wants to rewrite history, that's what I'm trying to do on this channel. It's taken an hour to do that. My videos are getting longer and longer. If anyone's still watching, why are you here? God, I'm just rambling on and on and on. God, but the thing is that when I come up with an idea like this to do an alternative prog top 10, it's not just, that'll be a cool idea. It's because I want to say something. I want to say something about our culture and how it operates. And I want to carve out a little space for true art, right? True art, where art really exists. And I think it really exists in all these lovely progressive rock albums, and in the work of Janelle Monáe and Louis Cole and Four Hero and Fishbone and Naked City and Squarepusher and Mr. Bungle and the Orb and Björk, and really with the Cardiacs. So if you enjoyed this video, please stick a like on it, and if you want to hear more, subscribe. It's been a long trawl, this one, as I apologise for that. And I have stepped over myself a little bit as I've tried to move towards this conclusion that I've reached at the end of this video that I wanted to say. So I apologise if I was a little bit clunky at the beginning of the video, but I'm going to keep it all in. You know how my videos roll. I'm done, I'm finished. You know, if you want to see more, subscribe. If you want to really go deep into what I'm doing, you know, then become a patron, please. Please become a patron and support me, because the more patrons I got, the more I can do this. You know, I'm on holiday at the moment. It's in the half-term holidays, and I'm spending my half-term holiday making videos. It's a big part of my life now, is coming in here and making these videos. So, you know, any support would be wonderful. You know, because at the moment my kids are sort of running around wanting me to take them out into the sunshine, which of course as a decent human being is far more important than waffling on about Van de Graaff generator, isn't it? Right, I'm done, I'm out of here, I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.